All right, we should be good to go. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the second annual Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Chelsea Ross. I'm Deputy Director at the Partnership for Strong Communities. We have a couple other Partnership for Strong Communities staff on with us today, Sean Gio, Kaylee Pratt, Exxon Bali Dumai. This year, Partnership for Strong Communities is hosting 3 days of sessions featuring local, state, and national experts leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address the key affordable housing issues in our state. Please join the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2021 on Twitter and follow us at PSC Housing if you aren't already. This session is titled Housing Connecticut's Future, Meeting the State's Affordable and Accessible Housing Needs. Before we turn it over to our presenters, we'd like to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and the Melville Charitable Trust. Their support has allowed this conference to happen again this year. Thank you also to our collaborating sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Webster Bank, and Rockport Mortgage. We also have a big list of supporting sponsors that have helped make this conference happen, including Beacon Communities, Capital for Change, Corporation for Supportive Housing, Elm City Communities, Fairfield County's Community Foundation, Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, JHM Group, LISC, National Equity Fund, and Trinity Financial. Last but not least, thank you to the sponsors for this session, Trinity Financial, Elm City Communities, CSH, and the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded and we'll make all recordings available to conference attendees as soon as possible. This session may also be broadcast on CTN. All participants have entered muted. Please remain on mute unless the speaker has asked you to unmute. If you have a technology issue, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send the chat to PSC Zoom meetings, Chelsea Ross, and I'll do my best to assist you. Your speakers today will let you know how they would like to have content questions submitted. And with that, I will turn it over to Christie Stewart.
Thanks, Chelsea. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully.
Looks good, Christie.
Looks good. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Christie Stewart. I'm the director of Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity. And I'm excited to share with you today a project that was a large team effort and a very heavy lift in the spring of 2020, right when everything was shutting down. The Connecticut Department of Housing and the Department of Social Services commissioned a groundbreaking study to basically do a landscape analysis on affordable and accessible housing throughout the state. Their directives to us were to create a roadmap for how to move forward by looking at the data on both affordable and accessible housing currently, and then looking at population projections going forward and other data projections, and trying to determine where we need to be at the end of 10, 20 years and advise on what the best way is to get there. It was my privilege to coordinate a very talented study team of national, regional, and local experts. We're joined today by my colleague Peter Tatian, a senior fellow at Urban Institute. Urban is a leading research and policy group based in Washington, D.C. Peter is an expert on housing assistance and preservation, among other things. I'm also joined today by my colleague Billy Huang, who is the principal at Source Development Hub, who will talk to you later in the presentation about the data visualization component of this report that he and his very talented team built out. Not joining us today, but an integral part of this project team were Data Haven, Corporation for Supportive Housing, and some of our colleagues at the Regional Plan Association. So thank you for joining us. We're going to walk through the data and analysis portion with Peter this morning, and then we're going to hand it off to Billy to walk through the data visualization portion of this study, and we will leave time at the end for questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom. If you put them in the chat, I'm sure we'll still catch them, and I will organize them and moderate getting them off to Peter and Billy. So with that, thank you again for joining us. We're really excited to share this work with you. Really hope that it provides an incredible baseline and foundation from which the state can set some housing goals, and we can all hold ourselves accountable for meeting those goals. So Peter, I'm going to hand it off to you and move the slide forward.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Christie. And hello, everyone. Great to be here today. As Christie said, I'm Peter Tatian from the Urban Institute, a senior fellow in the Metropolitan Housing and Community Center and part of the research team that did this study. So the study report has a lot of information, very comprehensive overview of housing in the state of Connecticut. And as you can see from here, we were really addressing some very fundamental questions about housing in the state, including who lives in the state of Connecticut, what kind of housing do they currently occupy, are affordable housing resources meeting resident needs, are accessible housing resources meeting needs, and then some thoughts about what Connecticut could do going forward to meet the current and future housing needs for both low-income households and households that include someone with a disability. So one of the first things we looked at was who's living in Connecticut and what kind of housing do they occupy and need. Connecticut's population has been declining in recent years, and we actually did this work before the 2020 decennial census data was available. So in fact, the 2020 census shows that Connecticut's population grew by about 1% from 2010 to 2020, which is relatively slow in the US. I think it's fourth or fifth slowest among the states in terms of growth. Also some analysis of those data by one of our partners, Data Haven, that they did after our study, showed that the 10 largest towns in Connecticut, the population of those 10 largest towns grew by over 37,000 people, while the population of 159 other towns in the state saw a population decline of over 5,000 people. So, you know, the overall story, which is something we echoed in our report, is that not just population rising or falling, but it's different in different parts of the state. And so we need to look at those conditions for specific areas. And so a bit more on that is the population of Fairfield County gained about 40,000 people. And also that the decennial census data show that the white population dropped by 78%, from 78% of the population in 2010 to 66% in 2020, while Hispanic, Black, and Asian populations also grew. So some of that's reflected in these charts that from our report, where we looked at some of the population trends across the state and in each of the counties. And so this shows the population changes for natural population change, which is births and deaths, which is the gray bars. The blue bars are international migration, so people from outside the country moving into or out of the state of Connecticut, and domestic migration, so people from within the US moving in and out of the state. And as you can see, there's been a real decline in terms of the domestic migration from the state population. That's been one of the things that has been driving the population downward, is people moving from Connecticut to other parts of the US. Whereas the international migration has been a factor driving population up, as has natural population change. As you can see as well, again, this varies across the state in different counties in terms of how much impact that has had on the overall population change in that county. So on the next slide, we did some work in the study to project population changes going forward. And our analysis projected a decline in Connecticut's population over the next 10 to 20 years, driven largely by three trends: relatively more people migrating out of the state than into it, an aging population, and a decline in the white population. As I mentioned, the decennial numbers, the decennial census numbers showed a slight increase in the state's population over the past decade, which was a little different than what we saw. The data we had from projections earlier was a smaller increase. So these numbers would change a little bit based on the new data, but not very much, because I think largely, again, the aging population is one of the things that's driving these forward projections, and that is a trend that we expect to continue. And so as demand, as population changes, so will demand for different types of housing. And again, this is very place dependent. So for example, even though you might have declining population and that might lead to more vacant single family homes in rural areas, for example, because of people passing away or more out migration, that may not meet the demand of housing for new international immigrants who may prefer smaller or multifamily housing in different parts of the state. So again, the overall decline is one part of the story, but so is what's specifically happening in different parts of the state. So on the next slide, here's some of the key takeaways from our study in terms of whether affordable housing resources are meeting needs for residents. And I'll show some of the data in a moment. But we did note that there is a relationship between production and pricing. And we noted in the report, Connecticut not keeping pace on housing production, perhaps, and particularly in certain areas, but places where there were higher increases in multifamily rental units had lower rent increases, so relatively more affordability. We looked at housing assistance and what some of the most prevalent forms of housing assistance were in the state. And also noted that over the next 20 years, a lot of housing, privately owned rental assistance will be coming up on the ends of compliance periods or contract dates. Now, much of this housing, based on past experience, will continue to be affordable, but these are things from a preservation point of view that the state should keep an eye on. And one of the biggest takeaways is that there's a large gap in affordable housing for very low income households. So if we go to the next slide, speaking more specifically to that gap, as you can see here, we have the blue bars represent the numbers of households, and the yellow bars represent numbers of housing units, and then they're divided up according to cost bands. So this is either what the cost of the housing is for the yellow bars, or how much, what the cost is that this particular set of households can afford for the blue bars. And very low in this chart is defined as 30% or below of the county median income. So we used county median incomes in the study to get a better sense of relative costs in different parts of the state. So very low is 30% of county median income. Low is 31 to 50% of median income. Mid-low is 51 to 80%. Mid-high is 80 to 120, and high is 120 and above. And so again, the main takeaway here is the large gap, over 86,000 units at the very low end of the cost band. There are 86,000 more households who need housing at that price point than there are housing units available. Now you also see that relative to the number of households, there are in some higher cost bands more housing units. that are currently in the stock compared to those households. That doesn't necessarily mean that those households are all adequately housed, because as you can see at the very top, we have the most high income households. There's a large number of those, but not necessarily the same number of units that are right at that price point. So they're going to be consuming households at lower cost housing units, and that takes up some of the supply that then takes away from units that might be affordable to lower income households. So, so there's the need to make sure that there's enough balance in the stock to meet the current needs. On the next slide, again, a lot of the data, wherever possible, we provided data, not just for the entire state, but also in different counties. And so you can see here on this chart how the cost of housing units varies across the state as well as individual counties. Generally, you see this kind of upside down sort of U shape where the biggest share is in the mid-low cost band, or the 51 to 80% of county median income. And then you see fewer units kind of on either side of that. The one notable exception here is Fairfield County, where there are also larger numbers of units in the mid-high and high cost bands as well. And again, we looked at data on housing assistance across the state. And so looking at different types of housing assistance as well as where that assisted housing is located. The vast majority of programmatic housing assistance is currently in Hartford County, which boasts twice as many incidences of different subsidies as the next highest county, Fairfield, and 4 times as many as the 3rd highest county, which is New Haven. Connecticut's largest concentration of state-funded assisted housing comes from its moderate rental housing program, which is about 5,400 units, followed by restrictive covenant housing, which is 1,000 units. And housing choice vouchers also represent the largest source of assisted housing in the state, over 43,000 units. So these are the table here showing is the state assisted housing, but federally assisted housing, of course, is a much larger. So 43,000, 44,000 vouchers, and 27,000, 28,000 Section 8 project-based units, and then about 14,000 units of public housing as well. So we wanted to talk more about, as well in the report, about what things Connecticut could do to best meet the needs of current and future housing needs for low-income households. And we identified these sort of 3 main themes in the strategy that we feel would be beneficial to the state. First is being more proactive in terms of investment. So in the current approach, developers identify projects and apply to the state for subsidies based on what works financially and meets the state subsidy program, affordability thresholds and other requirements. So, you know, this is does a good job of leveraging private investment dollars to produce and preserve affordable housing, but it is highly reactive as a strategy. So it deploys resources based on opportunities identified and cited by developers and not necessarily according to community needs or based on a coordinated strategy to improve housing access. So we think the data such as that provided in this report can help the state perhaps be a little more proactive in the way it allocates those resources. And as part of that, we feel a regional approach would be beneficial as well, to think about targeting populations in each county where the need for housing at particular cost bands and accessibility levels is greatest, and then prioritizing the investments accordingly. So again, you know, we think that information provided in the study can be helpful for doing that. So for as an example on this map, we have show here the number of cost burden renters by town in Connecticut, and then we show the county areas in gold outline as well. And so cost burden are those renters who pay 30% or more of their income on their total housing costs. And that is a level that's generally taken to be unaffordable by HUD and others in designing affordable housing programs. So this highlights the ability of the state to use data like this to deepen impact through a regionally focused approach. Applying this kind of geographic lens would enable the state to direct housing investments and balance local needs against the larger statewide strategy to distribute the cost and benefits of economic growth more equitably and rationally. And then, in addition, we have some more specific strategic recommendations around the types of policies and approaches that the state could take. Of course, some that the state is already doing, so some of those things that could be strengthened, but other things that could be looked into. And these fall into 4 general categories: producing more housing, particularly affordable housing, again, and trying to meet that very low income housing need. Preserving existing affordable housing, protecting renters and low-income homeowners from displacement because of new development or economic changes. And then lastly, more effectively documenting and monitoring housing across the state. So in the produce bucket, there's a number of policies that we talk about. And given the size of the gap between the supply of very low-income housing and number of households needing housing in that cost band, there's sort of an urgent need for the state to see more housing produced to prevent private market prices from rising further and to create a larger stock of low-cost units for cost-burdened households. So doing things like, again, creating a more regional guidelines for assisted housing production targets, incentivizing LIHTC siting based on cost burdens, and avoiding concentration of those units so that they can be providing more opportunity across key parts of the state. And also looking at a more transit-oriented approach to assisted housing production were things that we flagged that the state could look at. On the preservation side, creating new affordable housing is much more expensive than strategically preserving existing affordable housing, both naturally occurring affordable housing as well as income restricted units and assisted housing. And again, there's a large number of these units that will be assisted units that will be approaching end of contract affordability periods or compliance periods. And again, we don't expect that all of those will become unaffordable, but it's important to track that and to make sure that efforts are in place to preserve that affordability. So one way to do that is by creating and maintaining a database of affordable and accessible housing so that information can be used to inform preservation efforts, using more mission-funded driven developers to create and preserve affordable housing, creating incentives where needed to encourage private owners to keep housing affordable, and looking at other ways to preserve and improve the state's public housing stock, particularly upgrading units to meet higher accessibility standards, which will be needed as the population continues to age. On the protection side of things, the first 2 actions, again, focus on housing units, but the state, and this is, again, advice we generally give to everyone, is taking a tenant-based approach to housing by protecting residents from discrimination, displacement, and rapidly rising rents, and protecting homeowners from challenges that they may face as they age in place, for example. And this is of course very relevant right now through the Unite CT program. For instance, the state is providing emergency rental assistance to households who are facing eviction, and also unite CT resource centers across the state, which are partnerships with nonprofit groups, and others are available to assist people with those applications. But nevertheless, eviction is not something that's going to go away once the current pandemic is over and the economic crisis abates. So thinking about ways to avert preventable evictions for non-payment of rent is something that definitely will be needed going forward, along with some of these other ideas about ways to make sure that people are not harmed by development or economic changes. And then lastly, monitoring and documenting. So as part of our study, again, we try to gather as much data as possible on housing in the state. This was challenging at some times. Some of the data systems currently used are not very compatible with each other, don't necessarily lend themselves to easy data extraction or analysis. So we have made some recommendations in the report about how to improve that. And also, as part of this project, created a platform that everyone can use to find some of the latest information about housing in the state, and again, continue to track things that are as they change. So I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Billy Huang, to talk more about that platform and some of the data that we put together. So Billy?
Great, thanks so much, Peter. And Christy, would you mind if I shared my screen? Perfect. Okay. Perfect. Can you see the screen? Great. Okay. So good morning, everyone. I'm Billy Huang. I am the founder of Source Development Hub. Our team created an online dashboard and data management tool to supplement the work that Peter's team did on the analysis side. We also conducted analysis for the subsidized housing units that Peter talked about throughout the state, and that's in support of that work as well. And I'll describe some of those findings more visually in parts of this presentation. So when creating this dashboard, we realized that there were several different unanswered questions that we wanted to address. We wanted to understand holistically the universe of subsidies that are available in Connecticut, both federal and state subsidies. And really our core question was, what was the total number of subsidies throughout the state? It's a simple question, but it's also a difficult question to answer. We also wanted to ask questions like, what were the total number of, for instance, physical units with subsidies, or what do you do when subsidies expire, and when do those subsidies expire? And finally, we wanted to understand what were some of the long-standing barriers to this work, and what are the challenges moving forward with studies like this. And for this analysis, we sourced data sets from the Connecticut Department of Housing, CAHC, HUD, as well as from the National Housing Preservation Database. So you can see that from our data sources here, we obtained 6 unique sources from the preservation database, from CAHC's multifamily portfolio, 2 different HUD data sets that we got from the field office, as well as the Department of Housing's governmentally assisted and deed restricted list. And for that, each of these data sets contained a multitude of subsidy programs. And these are the programs there, which we then simplified by grouping them into classes, which included federal programs such as FHA mortgages, home funding, LIHTC development, various programs for the elderly like Section 202, Section 8 housing choice vouchers, as Peter mentioned, as well as several dozen state programs. This also allowed us to better understand the universe of programs and simplified the calculation process by grouping them. We were also able to disaggregate them into subclasses for certain calculations as well. So the fundamental challenge of working with multiple data sets with varying origins is that the data is differentially coded with varying levels of information. Some data sets are richer than others and provide a direct count of the units in each project or housing development. Some data sets also come with data dictionaries, which we either got or we had to deduce the coding for in other data sets. So the fundamental challenge needed to be addressed is really to standardize the unit of measurement. So for instance, a housing project, then to be able to index those units and then combining the index data. And some of the data needed to be transformed. And upon merging, after that transformation, the data needs to be deduplicated. For instance, 2 or more data sources may have the same data, but one source, which is more proximal from our understanding to program administration, should be prioritized. So for this project, we developed custom data dictionaries for each of the imported data sets, and then used those dictionaries to guide the data extraction, transformation, and loading process. So we create a pipeline where data can be standardized, merged, and deduplicated. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodologies used in this, but not to get too deep into the weeds, but it's really important to illustrate what some of the challenges are. Really what we started off developing in this pipeline was the extraction and indexing of project names. Because various project names can correspond to the same physical property, we needed to group projects by names, usually approximate names. So for instance, a project can be phased, such as Affordable Housing Development Phase 1 or Affordable Housing Development Phase 2, but we understand that they correspond to the same physical locations. So we essentially grouped them using 2 different string matching algorithms, Gerald Winkler, which is widely used, and Smith-Waterman, which is less widely used, with approximate thresholds determined by examining ROC curves from a training data set. We then had to geocode the index projects. That is, we needed to be able to map them. And again, because the fidelity of data entry highly varies between the data sets, we needed ways to parse out complex address strings, for instance, those that include apartment numbers. For this, we utilize a context-free grammar method and institute a custom set of what we call regular expression rules. And again, we validated these rules by examining the percentage of correctly geocoded addresses on Google. So after geocoding, we need to group subsidies by class. That's a relatively straightforward process, as we provide a data dictionary to group each of our predefined classes. Then we need to estimate unit totals. And because the totals had some of the units had multiples of the same subsidy. For instance, in the preservation database, you allow for 2 instances of the same subsidy name. We really needed to give an estimate of the range of units for a given subsidy by taking a lower and upper bound given the total possible physical units in that property. And finally, we needed to match project names across data sets. Again, we use 6 different data sets and be able to sum them up. And we use a similar fuzzy matching methodology to match up again by name. So, okay, where does this all lead us? It's a very complicated pipeline, and then that was validated at different points. But ultimately, what it gets us is a map. And here's a compiled map of the various subsidy classes. We see that for many of these subsidies, they're clustered in the largest cities. So around, the Hartford, New Haven, Bridgeport area, Stamford area. And along the central and western parts of the state, mostly along the I-95 or I-91 corridor. We see that in contrast to some other subsidies, some deed-restricted units, so these are the ones in blue, are located in a wider geography than many traditional developments such as Home or LIHTC, which are more the orange dots that you see on the map. So this, for instance, makes an argument that these deeds should be preserved, in part because they cover a wider geographic range in areas that may not be covered by other subsidies. So let's look at some of the numbers overall. And here, right off the bat, this is for the statewide. We see, as Peter mentioned before, that Section 8 vouchers, here, this is combined project-based and housing-based vouchers, comprise the majorities of the subsidies in the state of Connecticut. Section 8 non-voucher programs, such as RAD or mod rehabs, also rank fairly highly, followed by public housing. This is state subsidies here, which are the second highest, which can be broken down, into different parts. Moderate rental, as Peter mentioned, is one of the largest. These other classes are classes of accessible housing, so elderly housing as well as congregate housing. And that comprise the majority of the state subsidized units. Now let's take a look closer at some of the largest counties. We really see that different counties have proportionally different numbers of subsidies. So taking a look at Fairfield County here, for example, there is proportionally a much lower share of Section 8 vouchers. Here is 0.07 per renter household compared to Hartford and New Haven. Hartford has over double that per renter household count. We also see that public housing share remains highest in Fairfield County compared to Hartford as well as New Haven. And finally, LIHTC, which is the largest program for private investors to get involved in the game, remains low overall, but the lowest actually in Fairfield County compared to New Haven County and also to Hartford County. And so if you look at the absolute numbers, it appears that Fairfield County has overall less subsidies, primarily due to lower voucher counts. Hartford, as Peter mentioned, has the highest of them all, followed by New Haven in terms of the vouchers. So something that's really important is also to understand when housing affordability ends. And here we examine subsidy expiration as a function of time. So these are the different programs that you see here. These are the different times in 5-year increments. And we see it, the expiration for different counties. And so we see that many of them are actually coming offline by 2040. And we see that the rates of decline vary for different subsidies, but that housing affordability expires earliest, for instance, for home programs and Section 8 non-voucher programs. LIHTC is also very important because they have 15 and 30-year affordability milestones. And what we see is that the rates of decline is not the same throughout the entire state. And here I'll give the example of 4% LIHTC properties, so those under rehab processes. New Haven units, for example, in the green here, seem to decline much faster than those in Fairfield and in Hartford counties between the years 2025 and 2030. And so that's really just one example of how we see these units coming offline differentially depending where you are and also depending on program. So to try to understand the other side of the equation in terms of what's being built in the pipeline, we also source a data set from HUD to look at future developments. And here we show that there are various funding sources that get put into this pipeline. You can see those here with CDBGs, some CHAMP programs, flex programs, as well as the state housing portfolio programs and whatnot. But however, one major limitation of this analysis is that it's difficult to compare this data set with the previous data set, in part because these are funding sources and do not describe programs per se. So it's really difficult to link this up with the previous subsidy supply analysis. A future aim, for example, would be to examine how these funding mechanisms would lead to subsidies that we described earlier. Okay. So all this information, as well as additional information on county and town affordability, can actually be accessed through affordablehousing.tools, which is a website that we created to share our findings. We also developed an API, so an application programming interface, so that any user would be able to, or researcher, would be able to access our summarized data. The manual on the website contains instructions on how to really download the data. It's just you write a very short snippet of code and you'll be able to get all our tables. So we developed the API for the initial data analysis because we hope to be able to further develop this platform to be a centralized repository for future housing data sets. Right now, we've developed a database where you can sign up, and please ask us if you would like to sign up and upload your own data sets, so like a Dropbox of sorts. You'll be able to manage these data sets, and we hope to allow users to be able to share them as well. And in the future, we would like to develop automated pipelines to be able to do something similar to what we've done for this study, right? To process, clean, and merge data sets so that things become much clearer moving forward. So, and that concludes the presentation from me for today. A few takeaways, and these are some things that Peter have already covered and touched on. Section 8 vouchers comprise the vast majority of subsidies, located primarily in the cities along the transportation corridors. Congregate and elderly housing comprise most of the state subsidized, and I would say here these are the accessible units. Many subsidized units will come offline by 2040. So the fastest expiring are those associated with Section 8, Home, and Section 202. 9% LIHTC units are generally coming offline faster than 4% LIHTC units. What's really important is also I listed the detailed methodology that we did for this study, and it's really important because we had to essentially create that pipeline because data across sources is really non-uniform and the quality highly varies. There's a huge need to standardize data sets and provide data validation upon input. And we would highly suggest interagency data duplication efforts as well. In terms of the monitor and documentation, we would need to develop a unified database like the one that I've described to document and analyze the ongoing needs. And with that, I'd like to thank our partners at FCCHO and the Urban Institute for their roles leading this project, as well as our other partners, CT Data Haven and the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And finally, we'd like to thank the Partnership for Strong Communities for the privilege to share our findings with you today. Thank you, and we'll be happy to take questions now.
Thanks, Billy. I did just put in the chat, feel free to use the raise hand function or place your questions in the chat and we will answer as many as we can. And I just wanted to give a shout out and welcome to Kelly Davila from Data Haven, who worked very hard on this with us and was able to log on and join us. So any questions on any of the data or how we put the report together? I did put a link to the full report in the chat. It's over 100 pages, so you can read it at your leisure. Sean.
Just a question, Christie, how do you hope to see the different ways that the state might, the state government might use this assessment in the years going ahead?
Sure, that's an excellent question. So from FCCHO's perspective, we would love to see the state begin to set some sort of housing targets that are prioritized based on need. Our hope is that this data is a tool that policymakers will use going forward to take the limited resources we know we have for housing in the state and deploy them in a highly strategic fashion to meet the needs of Connecticut residents all across the state. Okay. I did want to just acknowledge a couple of questions in the chat. I know, Peter, you answered Melissa, but I thought this was a great question. What statistics are used to determine how many units are affordable for neighborhoods that are gentrified and when?
Yeah, thanks, Christian. So yeah, as I replied in the chat, so we're using data from the American Community Survey. We're looking at the actual incomes of households, both renter and homeowner households, and using that to determine what level of affordability of housing that they would be able to pay based on that income. So it's based on that, and then on the housing side, we're looking at what people actually pay in terms of rent or owner costs, including mortgage payments and other things for the housing where they're living. And so that's how we determine those two pieces. So those are starting at a point in time. We look at 2018 data, which was the latest we had available at the time we did the study, and sort of at that point in time, how do those two things look? But then we also, in the report, projected forward households based on affordability levels based on future income. So we also tried to look kind of more forward-looking at where affordability needs might be going over the next 10, 20 years. We did not do that at a neighborhood level. Our analysis is largely at the state and county level. I did also put in the chat, there is a section at the end where, where that map that we showed with the census tracts based on cost burden, we do have some information about a few cities and towns that we put in there. But again, our report is largely focused on county and state level analysis.
Thanks, Peter. Catherine just put a question in the chat. Will we be able to do an appended update based on 2021 data? It's also an excellent question. Not entirely up to us. We'll pose that question to the Department of Housing and see if they have any interest in updating this data. Margaret, hi, and I did see your question, and I did repost the link to the report. You can also find this report. It's on Urban's website, it's on FCCHO's website, and it's on Source Development Hub's website. Any other questions for this team? If not, we can end a little early. Is that okay, Sean? I don't know.
Absolutely. One thing, this resource, I know there's some questions about down some of the more neighborhood level data, and I think Mark was on this call, or Kelly is, but I'm just going to post in the chat a link to Data Haven's great town equity reports, and I believe those go down to the census tract level with a lot of their data, but they're a great resource. So in addition to the resources we heard today in this session.
Great. And Margaret, it sounds like you have a question. And oh, you put it in the chat. How should we think about this in comparison or contrast with the gap report from National Low Income Housing Coalition? Also an excellent question. Peter, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yes, and it's been a little while since I looked at that report, so I'm going to go a little bit off memory here. But I think that, first of all, I think we use some fairly standard metrics in terms of affordability criteria that would be similar to what NLIHC is using. I think, so it should be telling some fairly similar stories. But again, I mean, a couple of things that we did a little differently, I think, is we used county level median incomes as the kind of basis for our cost bands. We did that because we wanted to reflect the cost differences across different parts of Connecticut. So that's probably going to be different than what NLIHC used. And also, we did projections and going forward, which I know is not something that NLIHC is doing in their report. So those are two big differences. Hopefully, though, reports aren't telling contradictory stories, but yeah.
Okay. Anyone else? Sorry, if there's 70 people and it's hard to catch everybody's hands. Good. Well, I think that's it. Please reach out to FCCHO, to Peter, to Partnership for Strong Communities, to Billy. Any of us would be happy to answer questions about this. Encourage you to look at affordablehousing.tools, the GIS visualization of this data, play around with it and see how it can help your organization or region or town make more strategic decisions about how you will tackle this issue going forward. Thank you so much to the partnership for inviting us to present and to my project partners. And have a wonderful day, everybody.
Christie, if I could just say, our next session is coming up in 9 minutes at noon. There's for folks, is affordable housing opportunities from pandemic impacted commercial real estate. We'll hear from Beacon Communities and Mike Freemuth from the Capital Regional Development Authority. So tune in if you can. And thanks so much, Christie, Peter, and Billy, for all of your work. Appreciate it. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.